Hi, my name is Jordan Holloway. I'm a composer and the director of the virtual ensemble the Dad Village Symphony Orchestra. And today I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Dad Village Symphony and how it came to be, how it operates, how a virtual orchestra even functions, and what possible futures and opportunities lie ahead for the group. I assume most of the people watching this will have seen one of our programs before, but if you're not familiar, the DVSO is essentially a group of people who remotely record parts to new and diverse music, mostly orchestral works. I assemble these various recordings in an intense editing process that I'll talk about a little bit later, and then a program of these works is premiered on my YouTube channel. But there are a whole host of behind-the-scenes operations, even beyond just the recording and editing processes, that I'd love to share a lot more about so that folks can get a better idea of what we do and what our goals are, and also so that anyone thinking about starting an orchestra or project like this can get some ideas as to how they might want to go about starting such an endeavor. So let's start at the very beginning, back in everyone's favorite month, March of 2020. I was actually walking to a conducting lesson here at CU Boulder when we all got the email from the university that we were going to be shifting to remote learning for the remainder of the semester. The professor who I was studying with is the director of orchestras here at CU, and we had an orchestra concert planned 2 days later, so needless to say, we did not have the lesson. That concert, as well as a concert on our new music series that was scheduled for that evening, were both canceled, along with every other performance for the rest of the semester. I don't want to dwell too much on the COVID aspect of this, because I think there's only so much reliving of those first few weeks that we can each take. But this was just such a chaotic and sudden shift of mine and everyone else's lives being just tossed to the wind. At that point, I had another 2 days in Boulder before I would leave to stay with my parents for the rest of the semester, and it was in those 2 days that I had this burning urge to do something, anything at all, so that I could continue to work with my friends who were all about to leave for the rest of the semester. I'd seen all of these fun videos popping up of musicians recording all of the tracks to pieces so that they could play an entire piece by themselves, as well as people recording remotely with their friends to achieve a pretty similar result. And so the question arose for me of, can you do that with an entire orchestra? So to test the waters on whether or not anyone would even want to do this, I posted what was basically a Google Doc sign-up sheet on Facebook. And I basically just asked if anyone was interested in recording parts to an orchestra piece, and it turns out, yes, they were. And so I very quickly decided that since I was the one organizing all of this, I could use the overwhelming interest to my advantage and program my own first symphony, which I'm very grateful. People seemed very into, so that was cool. It was really shocking how much easier it was to get people on board with that than it would have been to get it programmed live. So that was just kind of an interesting thing. So to the question of, can you do this with an entire orchestra? The answer was still, I don't know, but at this point I'm definitely going to try. The next question is how you organize such a project. Believe it or not, a Google Doc isn't quite sufficient if you want to organize 45 people without combusting. So let's talk a little bit about the organization element of the orchestra, how it started, and how it works now. Getting 45 people to respond to your emails and send you things that you ask for on a timely basis is nearly impossible, especially if those people aren't getting paid, and in this case this is very much on a volunteer basis. And my lack of preparation for what a logistical nightmare organizing a project like this could be made it so that this took from March to July, 4 months, to release the final project. And even in the final weeks of the project, I was cramming in hours and hours of editing every single day just so that it could release on time. And the weird thing was that even when I didn't have tons and tons of recordings to edit, it still felt like I had insane amounts of work to do. Probably both because I was much slower at editing, so it took me a really long time to get anything done, and also because I had no barrier between the editing work I was doing and the people managing work. And with no help on the organizational front, it was at times genuine hell, not only because it sucks to message people who are first and foremost your friends and be like, hey, you said you'd send me this like 3 weeks ago, can I get an ETA? But also because just the sheer amount of effort that it takes to just keep track of that is just insane. It's by far the hardest and most stressful work that I have to do for DVSO. Compare that to our third project, Stages, which releases this week, by the way, and there's an earth-shattering difference in where my efforts are allocated. So what happened between now and then that made this so much easier? What are some of the vital steps in successfully organizing a virtual orchestra? Now, the first thing you have to consider is what your players need from you. That's really the most important part. And for this project, the three main things were parts, click tracks, and due dates. For my Symphony No. 1, I also made a document that showed the timestamps of rehearsal letters within the click tracks so that players didn't need to go searching around for those. But that was more of just a convenience thing. At the time that I had asked players whether or not they'd be interested in playing for a virtual orchestra, I had not made a single part to my symphony, meaning they had no music to read. I very quickly needed to extract and engrave the parts so I could send them out quickly and avoid establishing myself as a slow communicator, which, by the way, I failed at miserably. It took me probably a week of engraving parts for hours a day, and I also, for some reason, decided that they needed to be bowed, which is something that I have not revisited for DVSO, and if I ever do that, will be delegated. So the big lesson there was to have parts ready well in advance. Now when we do a project, I don't even reach out to anyone before I have an entire folder set up that has all sorts of subfolders within it for things like parts and click tracks, part assignment spreadsheets, things like that, so that I don't ever have anybody waiting on me to give something to them. They immediately have the tools that they need to get me what I'm asking for. A vital part of that big master folder, by the way, is a folder where people can submit their recordings. For our first project, we did not have that, and so I have spent hours of my life just looking for where people have sent me things. So if you can centralize that for everyone, that is the way to go. In terms of click tracks, it was relatively easy to make those, and not only did they have the clicks for the tempo, but they also had the note performer rendition of the symphony behind that so that they could intuit a little easier on things like musicality and pitch. That's something that hasn't really changed at all since DVSO began. I was also really bad about the deadlines, and if I remember right, I only had deadlines set for the string players because I communicated to everyone else on an individual basis, which was another terrible idea. I also had the deadlines staggered so that I was only requesting a specific movement by a certain date and then another movement maybe a week later or something like that. That was really just so that I could pace my editing, and so now there's not really any reason for that. The project started in mid-March and the latest deadline was in early May, but I didn't really send out any reminder emails or please tell me if you can't do this so that I'm not waiting on you emails. So I wound up receiving recordings well into July, so you can see just about how well that went. And I still face that problem to some degree now, but there are a few things that I've done to mitigate it, and one of those is having the rest of your organizational structure be in place before you even start thinking about deadlines. The very first email that I send has absolutely everything that everyone needs to record for the project, and that is absolutely vital. Another mitigating factor is that we're no longer living in spring of 2020, so I think in general people have an easier time self-motivating, including myself. And it's also very much worth recognizing that if you're not paying people, then they don't owe you their time and they don't owe you their punctuality. There is something to be said for, you know, if someone agrees to a project and agrees to a timeline, then they should at least be courteous about communicating. But in the end, they really truly don't owe you that, and so sometimes you just have to deal with it. So there are a lot of really obvious challenges, especially with the lack of structural integrity to DVSO's organization in its earlier days. But there's been one really enormous factor in changing that, and that has been the principal players. There's a principal for each section, and obviously in a virtual setting that doesn't seem to mean much other than like who gets solos in the string sections and stuff like that. But what it means for DVSO is that I pay these people to help me with the organizational process. They're the ones reaching out to players to fill their respective sections. They're the ones sharing the materials that I've organized. They communicate deadlines and send reminder emails, and they have saved me an incalculable amount of time. There have still been instances in which I've needed to help fill out some of the sections. For example, it's more challenging in general to fill out the larger string sections. So I still do a little bit of work there, but it is so much less work than I had to do for my Symphony No. 1 and for Biomes. We implemented this system after Biomes for stages, and it has worked beautifully. Also, for both Biomes and stages, I decided to establish a sort of general management team to help me with things like marketing and the managing process in general. And it has been really nice to feel like I'm not the only one who is in charge of this. The DVSO is now an ensemble whose direction is shaped by a group of people rather than just myself, and the roles that these people have played in helping me stitch this all together has just been absolutely invaluable. And so far that has consisted of myself, Claire Gunsbury, Grace Stringfellow, and Anushka Divakar, who are our principal flutist, oboist, and clarinetist respectively. But it is absolutely an element of the group that I plan to expand upon. And so the biggest lesson there was to ask for help. I didn't have any organizational help at the beginning, but I did ask for help in one element element of the project in particular, because as I assembled more of the recordings into Logic and lined them up, no matter what I did with my limited knowledge of the software, it just wasn't shaping up the way I wanted it to. So in the 11th hour, I contacted my friend Jonathan, who is much better at this stuff, for help. So we're gonna hear from him now and get a bit of insight into his side of the editing process and what exactly he does for DVSO.
I have it.
What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say that Grace Design should sponsor me.
Grace Stringfellow made this.
With yes.
So we're here in this closet where DVSO is brought to life, and we're here with the person who makes that possible. So would you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
My Jonathan is me.
That's awesome.
My name is Jonathan Galle. I'm a recording engineer in the Boulder area. I have background in violin performance and specialize in classical music recording on location and post-production.
Sweet. And so the first thing I want to hear from your perspective is how we started to work together in the summer of 2020 on the first DVSO project.
Oh gosh.
If you can remember that far back.
If I remember correctly, there were screams for help.
Yes.
And I was like, don't worry, Jordan. It's all good. I got you. And we met up, and I think you came over to where I was at, and we sat down. No, we did it virtually.
Mostly virtually.
Yeah. So
but first you came to my house.
That's right.
In my 100-degree room.
Oh Lord. And looked at your project and was like, oh, we need to work on this. And basically, for those of you who don't know, Jordan has everyone record a video of their performance with their phone or sometimes some better audio equipment.
Yes. And
then splits the audio from the video and does all the audio separately to line everyone up and make sure everyone's in sync. It's a lot of work. I've done it before. I hate doing that job. So thank heaven Jordan is willing to do that. And then once Jordan finishes all that, he sends the project to me, and I basically go through and do some mixing magic and make things sound more realistic, hopefully. And so first time we met up at Jordan's house, looked over the project, and I said, okay, well, let's do some work on this. And I think I started to mix it at your house.
Yes.
And then I took the project back with me, and we did the rest of the mixing over the internet. And basically, Jordan would zoom into my computer so he could manipulate things as well as me. And I would...
Also, like, you would give me control
Yes.
of the computer,
Yes.
which was something to behold while running Logic.
It was exciting is the word I would use to describe the situation. And but we made it work, and the first concert was a smashing success. And ever since then, we've been doing the same thing. We've moved, though, to actually doing it in a booth together instead of online. So that's this tiny, luxurious room here.
It's amazing. I really wish we could use these screens.
You and me both.
It'd be really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what are the main things? What are the main processes that you go through when I give you a project, particularly in that first one where I didn't know what the hell I was doing?
Yeah.
What were some of the biggest things that you tackled first?
Well, firstly, I wanted to try and make a realistic sound for each instrument in a manufactured space, because everyone's recording in different rooms. You don't really know. I mean, it's not terribly cohesive when you first get things set up and put into the project. And so first things first, I try and make each instrument sound similar enough to the other instruments around it, so that it's cohesive, and then I attempt to put it into a manufactured space to make it sound like it's in one place at the same time. And then I'll do some manipulating of sound with compressors and such to try and keep the levels similar across the board so that none of the instruments jump out at you above the rest.
What else would you say are just sort of the challenges of making it sound realistic? Things like, very slight differences in pitch and tempo and things like that. What sort of problems do those cause? And how do you go about fixing that?
A lot of times recording equipment, depending on how it's set up, may sound entirely different between instruments. Mm-hmm. So the first violin principal might sound really great, and then the second violin, or maybe the second chair violinist, first violins, whatever, might sound super muddy. And I want to use both of those tracks, obviously.
Right.
And so I have to find ways to manipulate the sound so that the muddy track doesn't overwhelm, you know, the principal or anything like that. And then also have to find a way to pan things so that things have a realistic spatial image. And I'd say timbre between different types. I'd say timbre between different recording environments and different recording equipment is probably the biggest hindrance.
Yeah, and so there are also tools that we can use to, if there are really slight discrepancies, things like you know, the flex pitch to just bring everyone in the same way. It's actually funny, I realized for this project I haven't really heard any of the raw recordings because I set up the tracks beforehand, and as soon as they're in there, there's a pitch corrector on them.
Yeah.
Which I told my roommate about that, who is one of the cellists in this next project stages, and she laughed because she was like, "Oh, you have to use a pitch corrector for this," and I was like, "Yeah, it's not because the players are like playing out of tune or whatever, but a matter of like 10 cents of a pitch in one direction versus like 10 cents of a pitch in another direction
is a huge
starts to compound on itself."
Well, and it's not the musician's fault either because
Right.
you know, when you're playing in an ensemble, you can tune to the group, and you can notice your discrepancies very quickly and adjust. But when you're playing by yourself, it's like you don't have anything to really compare it to.
Right. Yeah, and there is the like note performer rendition of the pieces, but it's really like not enough. The click is really the dominant thing there. And also, if there are like slight rhythmic issues, you can, you know, slice it up and just move.
Yeah, do a little
notes and fade them. That's something that I had to get really good at.
Yeah. Jordan does most of that. I try and stay out of that arena.
Sometimes I miss shit though, and I'm just trying to get it done fast, and we have to deal with it here.
Yep.
So those are some of the organizational and editing challenge of running a virtual orchestra, but there's another really big area of challenges. To me, it's the most important area, and it only came about as a result of wanting to do more projects after my Symphony No. 1. If the orchestra was going to be a recurring thing, it needed to have a vision.
I had been thinking for some time on the idea of doing more projects with DVSO, and while it was and still is a great way for me to get my music heard, the cultural reaction to the murder of George Floyd helped me realize that there were probably better things that the DVSO could be used for. Particularly in the field of classical music, there was this incredible circulation of all of these works that were never historically accepted as relevant, and so no one had really ever heard them before, or most people hadn't at least, and everyone who didn't already know was starting to realize what a tragic thing that was. I'd also been for some time considering programming the music of my friends and colleagues, because their music, like mine, wasn't as likely to be played by an orchestra because they weren't established composers, whatever that means. And orchestras in the United States at least don't seem to generally care about new music, so it was just sort of a similar feeling of wanting to program music that people hadn't heard before. So moving forward into our second project, which was eventually called Biomes, I tried to combine the different parts of what I envisioned for this orchestra into one program. So first, wanting to continue to use it as a platform for my own music, I programmed one of my own pieces, the Oceanic Scherzo for orchestra. Then I also wanted to include composers who were in a similar situation to myself and program their music in some way. And what I actually ended up doing was an orchestration competition where composers would submit their orchestrations of a piano work, and then I reached out to two of my friends and colleagues to do a similar thing with a different piano work. So then how do I include the part of the vision that is meant to help rectify the issue of historical underrepresentation? And my way of doing this was through the pieces that I selected to be orchestrated, and those were Lily Boulanger's 3 pieces for piano and Samuel Coleridge Taylor's Forest Scenes. And in doing that, not only do we have a bunch of composers and orchestrators who are getting intimate with some really lovely music, but we also have a version of these pieces that is now completely brand new, and that was an element of that was really exciting to me. Another element of the DVSO that I think is really cool is that since it's virtually premiered on YouTube, there's nothing that's logistically problematic about programming chamber works in tandem with orchestral works. And so we also programmed J.J. Berthume's Wind in the Wood for Woodwind Octet. Now, Biomes had a whole host of its own organizational issues, and if I had to do it again, it would probably look a little bit different, but I think it was a really solid step in the direction that I want to take the DVSO. And that brings up another really cool thing about this whole project, which is that we can experiment as much as we want with this and see what works and what doesn't, because there's no standard that you need to abide by when you're operating through such different mediums. And so that begs the question, where do we go from here?
In 2022, we have the incredible opportunity to work mainly with 3 composers, and those are Louis Taylor, Ernesto Aguirre, and Pranav Sivakumar, the latter 2 of whom were actually featured orchestrators on Biomes. Louis Taylor is the composer of the music that'll be featured on stages in just a few days, namely his Symphony No. 1, and the music of Ernesto Aguirre and Pranav Sivakumar will be featured on the next 2 programs following that, which, if all goes as planned, will both happen in 2022. Which, by the way, is a 300% increase in terms of concerts per year, and I really wish I could do more. In order to really program a true variety of things, you have to program a lot, and I hope that I have the ability to do that by monetizing the group and expanding my management team, because I really do think that that's something worth investing in. And there are so many questions beyond that. I've sketched up a few program ideas for beyond 2022, but it's difficult to see that far into the future when you realize how quickly things can change in such an experimental group. My hope is that we can continually find new and inventive ways to bring music to people, and that we can do so while hearing from both the voices of today and the underrepresented voices of the past. It's a very messy and sometimes scary process, and there are always going to be ways in which we could improve upon that process. But that's something that's really exciting to me, and I hope it's exciting to you too, and that you'll consider checking out some of our projects and following us on this journey. And I'm sorry, I have to say it, but I hope that this inspires you to mark your calendar for Stages, which is on March 19th at 7:30 US Central Time. I've spent countless hours putting this together, and over 50 musicians have put their hard work into this, so it would mean a whole lot to all of us if you'd consider checking it out. And in the end, none of this would have been possible if it weren't for those 70+ musicians who have given their time and energy to any one of these projects. Orchestral directors can't make music without orchestral musicians, and that has become painfully obvious over the course of the pandemic. I may do a lot of organizational and editing work, but none of that would mean anything at all if it weren't for the willingness of all of these people to be part of something new and different, and I am forever grateful to them. I hope you enjoyed this look into how the DVSO came to be and operates and where it might be headed, and I hope I will see you Saturday night for Stages. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.